Cameras live in 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon in Wisconsin. Good evening in London. Thanks for joining today's discussion. My name is Paul Robbins, and I'm the Dean of Environmental Studies at the Nelson Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the Institute, along with the Center for Culture, History, and Environment, and the Division of the Arts here at UW-Madison, are really excited to be part of this International Virtual Summit hosted by Invisible Dust. This is super cool. And I'm seeing several of my colleagues for the first time. I'd like to take the opportunity to give a big thanks to Heather Owens with the Division of the Arts, and Anna Andrzejewski and Rachel Gurney, who's from the Center for Culture, History, and Environment, for helping organize today's panel. Where I work at the Nelson Institute, we pride ourselves on interdisciplinary research and how faculty, staff, and students with interest in the arts can intersect with the sciences and the humanities and the public. And our interdisciplinary work is why we're excited to partner with Invisible Dust today. It's been really interesting to see answers to the question that was posed for the forecast opening question, which is, what is shaping how you think about the planet's future? And if you want to read responses to that question from around the world, you can visit a link in the chat. I think it's in there. It's the one that ends in forecast question. What is shaping how you think? And what shapes how I think are a lot of discouraging trends, things like vanishing ice, vanishing forest cover, what's happening to the world's oceans. But what shapes what I think is other kinds of megatrends, massive urbanization and upheavals in technology and strangely crashing birth rates. I mean, this is sort of a churning machine that keeps me awake at night. Our panel today is going to take a crack at answering that question in their own ways through interdisciplinary thinking. I look forward to hearing all of our speakers. Before I do, I want to acknowledge and to let us consider that where I sit at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dept since time immemorial. And in an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, land that they had stewarded for thousands of years, and which remains to this day a vital part of their identity and heritage. We value our partnership with the Ho-Chunk Nation, and indeed with the other 11 sovereign Native nations in the state of Wisconsin, and are keen to continue listening to voices of indigenous communities around the world. We encourage everybody to listen to and learn more about the land where you live and work. For today's discussion, we have a rock star lineup. Here's the run of show. I will introduce our three speakers. They will answer the question after I introduce all three of them in their own way for a few moments, take as much time as they need. Time permitting, I may ask one or two questions, but I think the more exciting part is that at about half past the hour, 1:30 local, 7:30 London, we're going to take questions from the audience. So as you listen to Carrie and Stephen and Jen, I encourage you to put stuff in the chat. Just ask the questions that you want to ask, and we'll try to get to as many or all of them as we can. So on to introductions. First, I'm going to introduce everybody. Jen Rose Smith, who is Assistant Professor of Geography and American Indian Studies in the Department of Geography here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm really pleased to know that our neighbors in the United Kingdom actually know what geography is. So that's good. Next, I'd like to introduce Carrie Hanson, who is founding artistic director of the Seldoms and served as the UW-Madison Interdisciplinary Artist in Residence in the fall of 2019. And I also add that she worked with the Nelson Institute's Center for Climatic Research to inform the piece you're going to see a fragment of, Flow, which debuted in Madison right before the pandemic. And I'm so sorry I haven't seen it yet, but after this is over, I will be there. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Stephen Hilyard, who is Professor of Digital Arts at the Department of Art here at UW-Madison as well. So let's kick off this discussion, hearing from each of you, I think Jen, then Carrie, then Stephen, about the theme of the panel. How can ice be viewed as a metaphor for our planet's uncertain and fragile future? And how is that reflected in your own work? Jen?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the Invisible Dust team for having me today, for inviting me. Yes, as Paul said, I'm an assistant professor in the geography department. I'm also cross-appointed in the American Indian Studies program here at UW-Madison. I am dAXunhyuu, or Eyak. I'm Alaska Native. I was born and grew up in Alaska. So questions of ice are very much at the fore for me. So to answer this question, I am just going to talk a little bit about my book manuscript. So I'm currently working on a manuscript titled Icy Matters, Race, Indigeneity, and Coloniality in Ice Geographies. So Icy Matters undertakes an analysis of coloniality in icy locales to demonstrate how ice has been a foundational object for making sense of the world and beyond. The book interrogates how ice as a materiality, a scientific data set, and a cultural imaginary is entangled with colonial and racial dimensions of power. Ultimately, in my manuscript, I show that ice has long been a terrain of conflict for creating and maintaining white supremacy. Ice animates the look and feel of climate change. Mainstream broadcasts depict melting glaciers and ice sheet collapse to mass audiences. Today, ice is melting faster than ever before, causing social upheaval among northern and coastal indigenous communities in particular. Melting ice will continue on to disrupt a more temperate world as sea levels rise. Conditions of ice are now a key interest for economic, academic, and activist stakeholders as the unsettling potential of ice shapes the ways that humans understand, respond to, and plan for the future. Yet, ice has always been at the center of making sense of the world. Reflections on ice have long been a constitutive element of Western political thought, and therefore is entangled with colonial and racial power dynamics. Historically, spaces of ice in the Arctic and Antarctica have been key sites of Western imperial scientific exploration, and therefore the identity making of white nationalism and masculinity. The material qualities of ice did more than make white male explorers uncomfortable and filled with both fascination and dread, as their many journal entries demonstrate. The chemical composition of ice also shaped the emergence of academic disciplines and sciences like chemistry. Ice has also been a challenging materiality to capture. It has often defied the photographic lens, the brush, and pencil due to its immensity in glaciers and ice sheets, and its reflective qualities. However, in the modern moment, drones and satellite images are increasingly more successful at surveilling and monitoring the movement and change of ice scapes. Material spaces of ice have also been weaponized by Enlightenment philosophers through concepts of environmental determinism to racialize indigenous peoples who call the Arctic home and homeland. Within these notions, extreme environments of the North supposedly rendered indigenous peoples of the Arctic intellectually and corporeally inferior, particularly in distinction to those inhabiting more temperate zones. So these early foundations of race thinking influenced cultural and scientific knowledge production about ice and humanity, and continues in contemporary forms through discursive iterations in the dominant rhetoric of the Anthropocene. Such histories are enmeshed with contemporary coloniality and racialization, yet often go overlooked to favor generic, grand, planetary narrations of ice that are meant to tell a general we something about humanity's past and humanity's future. Those narrations include images of melting ice cast as iconic representations of climate change, wreaking havoc on a doomed planet. But ice remains unmoored from its socio-political origins and context. Other capitulations utilize ice as a scientific data set, such as through the Ice Core, which is meant to tell deep environmental histories of the globe. My mom is calling me. Okay, so the Ice Core, which is meant to tell deep environmental histories of the globe that all humans supposedly experienced or inherited equally. These narratives fit easily within the Anthropocene narrative. but Francois Vergès has critiqued as an easy story to tell because, quote, it does not challenge the inequalities, alienation, and violence inscribed in modernity's strategic relations of power and production, end quote. So ice has been an integral materiality and phenomenon in creating such sweeping stories about generalized humanity's past, present, and future. I contend that it is important to hold together the consequences of these grand stories about ice that have narrated historical ideas of race and now contemporary narratives about human futurity and loss. Thank you.
That's great, Carrie.
Hi there. Thanks, Paul. I wanted to just begin, because I'm speaking from Chicago, I just wanted to acknowledge the land from which I speak. Chicago is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and Ho-Chunk also call this area home. So as Paul mentioned, I have a dance company. I identify as a choreographer primarily, but I work with a lot of different practitioners from other disciplines. And that means not only theater practitioners, composers, fashion designers, architects, but also we work with historians and scientists in the role of consultants and responders to the work that we make. My plan for today is to show you a clip of, or two clips actually, of Flow, and that's spelled F-L-O-E. And we premiered this at the Wisconsin Union Theater in January 2020, right before the shutdown. And the piece is a piece about climate crisis, and we focused on two regions in making this piece. We were thinking a lot about the Arctic, and then we are also thinking about coastal communities. And we, in fact, took a research trip down to Houston and were able to interview people that had been directly affected by Hurricane Harvey. So that became part of the audio content. So just two things about the Seldoms sort of approach and choreography in general. And that is that first, we make multimedia performance pieces that speak to serious issues, believing that dance can actually be persuasive about that. And the second aspect is that instead of thinking about like working with a sort of effortlessness, we're interested in more of a staging a body that appears to be working through problems, and sometimes those are intractable problems. So we like to show the effort, and we like to show like the work and the labor. And the idea there in part is that hopefully if viewers are seeing problem-solving bodies on stage, then they might be, and their exertion, then they might be inspired to problem-solving stances of their own. So I'm going to show you a quick clip, or a 2-minute clip here. And a few of the choreographic motifs that we were working with were based on ice and calving and sort of a fracture. And you're going to also hear within the audio, you're going to hear recordings of like field recordings of the ice shelf. You're going to hear birds, sound of birds, and water dripping. So again, working with audio designers and costume designers and everyone to tell the story. And I will share my screen now. Are you able to see that? Great. Okay, and just a few other mentions about what was happening there, because you can't see the whole piece. There is a monologue in which Seth Boakley, the playwright, is talking about the Albedo Effect and how the Arctic ice is kind of the roof of the world. And so we use the white hat as a metaphor for, again, the roof of the world. And so you keep seeing this hat nearly falling to the ground, and then it's caught by someone. The next clip that I want to show is you're going to hear the voice of Ken Dunton, and he is on faculty at the Marine Science Institute at UT Austin. And Ken has been researching up in the Arctic for about 30 years, and most recently has established a long-term ecological research station at the Beaufort Sea Lagoon, and is working, I think, in Kaktovik with Inupiats. And so you'll hear his voice talking about an event that he witnessed there. And bear with me, I just have to manually go forward to 2606. Okay, that's good enough.
Inupiats are accustomed to going out in their boats and fish. They do it all summer long, and their boats are not designed for big waves, and because they don't only see big waves. And a family went out and went fishing, and we're gone for a while. And I remember being on the beach at Kaktovik with a local native who was butchering a bearded seal they had just killed. And I was talking to him about the bearded seal. I wanted to see the stomach contents, what have you. And all of a sudden, his cell phone rang. And he talked for a few minutes in Nunavik. I didn't understand what he was saying. And then he just left. He left the ulu there. He left the walrus. I mean, the bearded seal there. Didn't say a word and just took off. And I was left standing there going, what's going on? I mean, I didn't understand. It was a few hours later when we saw the whole town, things moving very quickly in the town, boats being mobilized and pushed into the water, and people running everywhere, that we found out that at the moment he had received that phone call, a boat had come back with only part of the family had left a week earlier, or several days earlier, and that was the mom of one of the boys. And she had quite a story to tell, in which they had been on a barrier island, they had been in a spit, they had been camping out, the boat was anchored, and the wind came up. And they were just getting ready to have dinner, and they just finished fishing for the day. And the wind came up, and the seas came up, and all of a sudden, the island that they never normally see inundated with water in the summertime, all of a sudden, it was awash with water, and the boat, which had been anchored nearby, all of a sudden broke its anchor and started drifting away. And so the father started running after the boat through the water, and his 15-year-old son following him. And the boat got into deeper and deeper water as the wind and waves pushed it off the shoal, and they both were swimming for it. And in the process of swimming for it, they both drowned.
So yeah, I'll just stop the clip there. Again, that was Ken Dunton, who is researching up in the Arctic currently. And I had wanted to get the dance company and some of the artistic collaborators up there, but it's rather expensive to travel up there, so we weren't able to do that. You perhaps had seen one of the again, choreographic motifs that we were working with was interconnectivity. The dancers are often linking, and we felt like that was really kind of a metaphor for this whole story about the interconnectivity of ecosystems and the interconnectivity of peoples as we approach and move through this problem. And I'll close there.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Hilyard, and I'm in Madison also. And I am a multimedia artist. So let me see if I can share a screen here with you. Can everyone see that? Ice? Yeah. Okay, I've got ice. Yeah, so my work deals with various forms of the profound, things like true love, the sacred, the infinite, and often the sublime experience. So these are all concepts that I think of as being ideals, which means that they can never be fully realized in real life, and they always to some extent fail. And yet they're very persistent in our culture, and I'm interested in that persistence in the face of repeated failure to achieve these ideals. So I went to the Arctic looking for sublime landscapes, and I found them. This is the Svitjodbreen Glacier in Svalbard, and this is a landscape I made in Iceland. This is from a series of images called Rapture of the Deep, which were all shot at the bottom of a lake in Iceland. So I had worked with these kind of abstract ideals and with landscape a lot until the first time I went to Svalbard, which is an archipelago of islands in the high Arctic, where I came across a different kind of ideal, one that I'd never dealt with before in my own work. And that's a political or social ideal. This is the town of Pyramida, which is a ghost town. It was established by the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 20th century. And at one time, it was the northernmost town on Earth. And it was part of a competition of ideas taking place in Svalbard during the Cold War. So before the 20th century, nobody had ever been interested in the Svalbard Islands. And that's why they are still not part of a country to this day. And they had never been settled as far as we know. And at the beginning of the 20th century, as the rivalries between the Soviet Union and the West began to take center stage, suddenly Svalbard became strategic. And the West and the Soviet Union both established these showcase communities in Svalbard. So the Western community is the Norwegian town of Longyearbyen, and the Soviets had Pyramida and a second settlement called Barentsburg. And none of these communities had any practical purpose. They weren't viable as coal mines, which is ostensibly the reason for them to be there. They were intended as a foothold in the contested Arctic territory, and particularly on this international territory of Svalbard. And they were intended to prove the superiority of the social and political systems that they represented. So Pyramida was created as an ideal Soviet town of 1,000 men, women, and children. And it had schools, it had hospitals, indoor farms, sports facilities. This is the floor of the northernmost basketball court on Earth, which looks like a constructivist painting, which particularly interested me. They had a heated swimming pool, a theater, a ballet studio, a grand piano. All of these things were the northernmost examples of whatever it was on Earth, including the northernmost statue of Lenin, of course. And they even imported a square mile of soil and planted special grass there to create 1 square mile of Russia. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 1998, the Russian Federation went bankrupt and Pyramida was evacuated over the course of 48 hours. So once the Soviet ideal no longer existed, which was the reason for Pyramida to exist, there was no more need for Pyramida to prove the superiority of that system. So it disappeared, literally overnight. So I'm just finishing up my piece on Pyramida. It's a 3-channel experimental movie called Katyusha. And it deals with the way that we project onto wilderness. And this is something that I've dealt with in earlier projects. We project our culture onto wilderness, and our point of view on wilderness is not fixed. It's a function of our culture, which is always changing. So the people that created Pyramida saw the Arctic as a proving ground to prove the superiority of their system, that they could have a thriving community at the furthest north point on Earth. If we look at say, an earlier project of mine, like this Rapture of the Deep project, this is looking at the phenomenon of mountaineering and extreme sports, freediving as well, and the way in which this kind of view of wilderness as a place to find a spiritual experience, to find redemption, is a product of the Romantic period and would not have been possible without the history of Romanticism and the idea of the sublime landscape. So in all of these cases, what's happening is that we're projecting our ideas of what we are looking for in the wilderness onto this blank screen. And I think the Arctic is a particularly suitable place for this kind of cultural projection and wilderness in general, because these places have nothing to offer us in practical terms. There's no food, there's no shelter, the climate is deadly, and oftentimes these places aren't even beautiful. So we only go there temporarily. We go there, like the mountaineer or the diver or the Arctic explorer. We're there temporarily because of what we're able to bring with us. And what we find there is what we have brought with us. It's not a part of the place itself. So in the case of Pyramida, the state saw it as a proving ground for their political and social system. The mountaineer goes to the wilderness looking for spiritual redemption. Mary Shelley presented the Arctic as a metaphor for the dangerous pursuit of knowledge and the madness that ensues. But these are all cultural projections which tell us much more about the person experiencing them than they do about the place itself. So the Arctic ice for me is really a perfect mirror for a self-aware species like ourselves. And so for me, this is a wonderful access point for the true subject of my work, which is really the workings of the human mind and the poetic structures that we share through culture. So I guess my answer to the question would be that ice, in the context of wilderness, is a mirror through which we can understand ourselves, for better or worse. And different people are going to see different things in the mirror. And what shapes what you think is culture, which I think is an optimistic point of view, because we can, anyone that studies culture can see the way that it changes. It's mutable, it's always changing and growing. So it's not fixed. So I will leave it there for now.
Sorry, please leave questions for the panelists in Q&A here. Yes, you're muted, Paul. We've only been doing this for a year. So go ahead and we'll see what we get. I'll be waiting on folks behind the scenes to feed me some questions from the community, but maybe until one comes in, I have a question for you as a panel. How, is there something you heard in one of the other panelists that you want to respond to? Is there something that either spoke to you or you want to brush against, or that sort of ignited something? And maybe we can start with, we'll just go in a circle again. We start with Jen. Is there anything you heard that you want to sort of respond to in this representational question?
Sure. Carrie, I'd love to hear more about flow and just more of like what is happening on stage. What was the sort of thought process behind creating this? It just seems so interesting and I can't wait to watch it.
Well, thank you. I would also say that we used not only the play circle, which is what you just saw in the Union, but we also used the larger stage. Where, if I may, I'm going to do another screen share and show you. This is a, are you able to see this image? Okay, so in the larger space, we had two large inflatables, and it is not lost on me that in blowing up these inflatables and all of the apparatus of the theater that we're using a whole lot of energy to do so, But we use these two large inflatables to portray in a sort of abstract way ice. And another thing that we did, which we've always done at UW-Madison, is to work with a community cast. And this is Lynn Lum, and she created this really beautiful, slow-moving solo about glaciers. And I will say that in addition to working with the community cast, we also pulled in the Nelson Institute, some Nelson Institute grad students who we worked with them to sort of create or take their research and write them into scripts, and then they narrated those scripts as they became audience guides for the audience to move from one space to the other. And so for me, the way that this unfolded at UW-Madison with so much support from so many different entities on campus is like exactly how a performance piece should play out, right? We had community performers, we had people coming in from science to give more detail and more substance. And so, Paul, back to your original question about what did my response as I was listening to Stephen and to Jen is that the level of detail that you're talking about is something that I'm always trying to press through the performance piece, whether that's through dance or through the film or through the set design, audio design, but which is hard to get at. Yeah. So that was my thought as I was listening to your projects and the information that you have.
We'll come back to that. We have a question from the audience before we reach out to Stephen and Jen, to Stephen and Carrie for their questions for the other panelists. So I've got a question from the audience which regards Dr. Smith's framing of the kind of colonial history, view, practice, representation, interpretation of the ice in the Arctic. And then, Stephen and Carrie trying to interpret through their, non-native lenses. Is there some way to sort of reconcile or talk about the tension in those, Carrie? And let's start with Stephen, maybe. You see what we're driving at there.
Yeah, I think, the project that I've been involved, that I've been kind of absorbed in for the last 6 or 8 years is really about colonization. It's about the Soviet Union and Norway representing the West, entering this blank spot on the map and attempting to assert themselves. The difference there is that, as far as archaeologists can tell, that Svalbard was never settled by native people. The Inuit or the Sami were never there. What's interesting is that both the Soviet Union and Norway have attempted to prove that their people have ancestral claim to that land through settlement, through archaeological attempts to prove archaeologically that the Pomor people from northwestern Russia had settled there, or that Vikings had settled there, both of which endeavors are kind of suspect. And it seems like nobody ever really was settled there up until the beginning of the 20th century, because it is so remote and cut off. But I think the whole this whole process of kind of cultural assimilation doesn't even require there to be other people there, in the bigger picture, when you're coming into a landscape. But then obviously elsewhere there is the kind of histories elsewhere in the Arctic are the same kind of shameful histories that you find everywhere else in the world.
Thanks. Either Carrie or Jen, is there anything more you want to say on that question that came from the audience there about the sort of politics of glacial representation?
Well, as I've been doing my work, I realized that as a kind of a storyteller, it just seems more and more important to be able to work with people in the community, to really center community knowledge and to have access to their stories in a very direct way, and to include them through different steps of the process. So when we were down in Houston and were conducting those interviews, that felt really both honest, and it felt really central to making that work.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. Jen, any thoughts before I go? I've got another question from the audience. No, Jen, yes?
We can move forward.
Okay, so there's a question about some of the representations, especially Stephen and sort of the modernist Soviet project, beautiful images, about hubris and the socioeconomics of the hubris of socioeconomics imposed on these landscapes that responding in complicated ways to the global energy economy. What do you think about that? The Icarus effect, the overreach.
Yeah. Well, in a way, everything I showed you and much of the work I've done about wilderness is about hubris. It's about the kind of arrogance of feeling that you understand a place that you really have no connection to. At a species level, even beyond a cultural level, and that the communities of Pyramida and Longyearbyen are good examples of that, in that they are subsidized communities that only exist to compete with each other, and they have coal mines there which mine enough coal to keep the lights on in each town. But they're not able to, they're not commercially viable as coal mines, they never were. So they are maintained or were maintained at great expense and with great expenditure of energy and all kinds of other resources as part of a competition, just the way the missiles were and everything else. And there's a huge element of hubris there too. But you could also argue there's hubris in the mountaineer who attempts to reach some deadly summit, or puts other people at risk that may have to rescue him. There's a kind of level of there's a thin line between ambition and arrogance and hubris, in general, and that the wilderness really brings that out in our species, I think.
Certainly in the people, coming in from outside. So Jen, do you have any thoughts? You sort of touched on that a little bit in the explorer history references you made to Arctic ice landscapes.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things to remember and to sort of keep at the fore is that places that seem, particularly extreme in their either coldness or iciness are really habitable spaces that human beings have been living in for many, many years, since time immemorial. And even to expand beyond that understanding of the human-centered approach of thinking about the world, that these are indeed vibrant landscapes and vibrant spaces which have been home to many living things for a long, long time. Yeah, I'll offer that.
Great. There was a question out there in the chat, or in the question in the Q&A. What was the name of the islands? It's Svalbard, I believe, with SV.
Yeah, Svalbard is the Norwegian name. The Dutch name is Spitsbergen, and that's the Russians tend to use Spitsbergen. It's a very kind of multinational place in that various nations used it as a base for whaling and extracting minerals and things like that. And the very first people there were Dutch, but they don't have a big say right now. But so Svalbard, I think it's more romantic than Spitsbergen, but either one works.
Thanks. There are more questions coming in about the tension in the. I'll signal the tension between hubris in the universal human sense, right? In the anthro, the species sense, versus kind of a white settler imposition. I'm not sure how far down that road we want to go, but I want to signal some interesting Q&A around, in a sense, it counts this notion of a mirror. What we see in these landscapes is what we put into it. Carrie, in your work and your representation, you mentioned your experience in Houston. You never got to go to the Arctic. Were there conversations about some of these representational tensions, some of the politics underlying how we think about ice?
I will say that we experienced tensions about trying to, this is a different sort of tension, in trying to truthfully, accurately tell the story is just funding, right? For artists to get to where they need to go. I recall that in even thinking about going to up to Kaktovik, Ken Dunton had wanted, the scientist that you heard, had wanted to invite the Seldoms up there. And even thinking about traveling up there, we were talking a great deal about what would that be? That would not be the same as the Seldoms doing a residency in Madison, Wisconsin. So to interact with the Inupiat locals there would take a lot of relationship building and just a different sort of timeline altogether. And then I will also say that when we did go to Houston and we were gathering some of those stories and conducting those interviews, there was some pushback at certain levels about, I think one of the things I run into a lot as an artist is who gets to tell the story. And I'm navigating that all the time, and I'm not sure that I always do. I always make the right choice, but working at it.
That's a great answer. All right, so we're just about at time, but I have been asked to ask all the crises that are being represented here, the crises facing Indigenous people, the crises, the overreach of the technocratic imagination, and the climate crisis. How are the arts? What's the scope to scope this message? What's the role of the arts? Briefly, how does this work? Does it give us new possibilities? These kind of modes of representation. I mean, obviously you think so. So can you say a few words about it? Start Carrie first, then maybe Stephen and Jen.
Sure, I'll go first.
And we'll end.
I'll go first. I will go back to the conversations in Houston, and to a person, everyone that we spoke with talked about the experience in an embodied way. They talked about what was happening to the hands as they were pulling down, ruined drywall. They were talking about, just like the level of sort of trauma at a body level. And so I think that a really articulate, expressive body can show us these different sorts of effects of a situation on a human.
Great, thank you. Stephen, they're stunning images. They're extremely powerful. So you have just a few words on that tied to the message?
Well, I like to believe, I've been interested in this idea of cultural projection and the power of culture with a small c to shape our image of the world and our ability to conceive of the world around us, and obviously also our behavior in the world. And I like to believe that that's optimistic in that culture can change and grow. And in that case, the role of the arts would be to be part of that change and part of that growth, in changing our understanding of our place in the world as being at the mercy of nature, and showing that it's actually the other way around now, that nature's at our mercy, and that we have a definite interest and a moral obligation to behave that way.
Thank you, Stephen. I was told by one of my professors in graduate school that nature always bats last. Jen, any thoughts to close on sort of representational politics and possibilities in this space?
Sure, I'll just say that I think that it's important to center Indigenous sciences, Indigenous research, and Indigenous narratives, and put those at the center, and especially ones that are told by Native peoples themselves in ways that don't necessarily play into the spectacle of devastation and decline only. That there are ways to tell this story that is getting the political purchase of things need to be addressed, but also that life is more capacious and more, there's space for things outside of the polemic. So I'll say that, and I think that that arts have a big part in that, and particularly in the Arctic, there is a kind of overemphasis on sort of hard science or data that can be, collected and correlated to respond in very specific ways. But articulations outside of maybe particular science data is absolutely crucial to the ways that we can understand alternative futures than the one that we're currently experiencing.
Right.
I would have to support that, that this isn't just a physics problem. This is a human problem. It's a human story. And so it's going to take more than science, I think.
All right, so maybe we close on that. We're a few minutes over, but it was extremely productive, almost stirring. I look forward to seeing Flo. I look forward to seeing some of your work, Stephen, and I always read Jen Rose Smith. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks to Invisible Dust, and thanks to everybody who joined and asked questions. Everybody, hang in there. We'll be outside soon.
Thank you. Thanks.